April 17, 1945, outside Magdeburg, Germany. The sky hung grey and low as a column of exhausted women trudged along the muddy road, their hands clutching small bundles of belongings, their eyes downcast. They were members of the Women's Auxiliary of the Wehrmacht, stenographers, radio operators and support staff, now prisoners of the advancing American forces. Among them walked Helga Müller, a former secretary to an SS officer, who had spent the past 3 years being told exactly what to expect should she ever encounter the enemy, especially the black American soldiers she'd seen depicted in Der Stürmer propaganda magazines. She believed she knew what was coming, but the reality would prove to be something she could never have imagined. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is a story of how music, specifically jazz deemed degenerate by the Nazi regime, would become an unexpected bridge between worlds, and how Helga and dozens of other German women would find their years of indoctrination undone not by force, but by the universal language of rhythm and improvisation. The American 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, had been fighting continuously since landing in France 6 months earlier. Despite their extraordinary combat record, 183 days of continuous action, more than any other armored unit in the European theater, they remained segregated from white troops, subjected to prejudice from both allies and enemies. Technical Sergeant Marcus Washington, a tall man from New Orleans with hands equally skilled at manning a .50 caliber machine gun or coaxing sublime melodies from a trumpet, sat atop his Sherman tank as it rumbled toward the temporary POW holding facility outside Magdeburg. "Eyes sharp, gentlemen," called Lieutenant James Coleman, the platoon leader. "Intel says we've got a transfer coming in, female auxiliaries, mostly clerical staff." "Clerical staff with their heads full of Goebbels garbage," added Sergeant Raymond Jackson, the tank's gunner. A former factory worker from Detroit, Jackson had seen firsthand how propaganda could poison minds even back home. "Well, they're about to get a real education then," Washington replied, scanning the horizon. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was fighting for freedom in Europe, while his own family in Louisiana couldn't even use the same drinking fountains as white folks. Just hope they don't faint dead away when they see who's guarding them. The temporary holding facility had been hastily established in an abandoned school. Captain William Foster, the white commanding officer of the security detail, reviewed the transfer orders as the trucks carrying the female prisoners approached. The facility already held over 200 German women, most of them captured while working at military installations as the Allied forces pushed eastward. "Washington, Jackson, your detail will process the new arrivals," Captain Foster ordered. "Standard procedure. No special treatment, but no harassment either. These women aren't Waffen-SS. They're clerks and telephone operators." "Yes, sir," Washington replied, mentally preparing himself for the reactions he'd seen countless times before, the shock, the fear, sometimes the disgust when Germans first encountered black American soldiers. The propaganda had been relentless, portraying black troops as savages, barely human, to be feared more than the Russian forces advancing from the east. Frau Gerda Schmidt, the senior prisoner among the previously captured women, watched nervously as the trucks arrived. At 43, Schmidt had worked as an administrator in Wehrmacht headquarters in Berlin before being evacuated westward. She had taken it upon herself to maintain order among the prisoners, a role the Americans seemed content to let her perform. "Remember what I told you," she whispered to the women around her. "Eyes down, no speaking unless spoken to. The Negro soldiers." She hesitated, not wanting to voice the rumors that had circulated throughout Germany. "Just stay together." The truck stopped in the muddy schoolyard. Helga Müller descended stiffly, her legs cramped from the long journey. At 24, she had spent her entire adult life under the Nazi regime, her worldview shaped by its ideology. The stenography skills that had made her valuable to the Reich now seemed worthless. She clutched her small suitcase, containing a spare dress, a toothbrush, and the only photograph she had of her parents, who had been killed in an Allied bombing raid on Hamburg. The first person she saw was Technical Sergeant Washington, standing tall beside the processing table. Their eyes met briefly, and Helga quickly looked away, a chill running through her despite the mild spring temperature. "Name?" Washington asked in halting German, the words carefully memorized. "Müller? Helga?" she replied softly, not raising her eyes again. "Profession?" Washington continued, pen poised over the intake form. "Stenographer, Wehrmacht Headquarters, Dresden." Washington nodded, making a note. "Possessions?" Helga reluctantly placed her small suitcase on the table. Private First Class Robert Johnson, a stocky man from Philadelphia, carefully opened it, documenting the contents before returning it to her. "Next," Washington called, and Helga moved forward into the compound, her heart pounding. She had survived the encounter, but now faced weeks or months of captivity under guards she had been taught to fear. Inside the converted school building, women were assigned to classrooms that now served as barracks. Frau Schmidt quickly approached Helga and the new arrivals. "You'll be in room 4, she said efficiently. 6 to a room. Meals are at 600, 1200 and 1800 hours. The Americans are correct in their timekeeping, if nothing else. Latrines are behind the building. We maintain them ourselves." She lowered her voice. "The Negro soldiers keep their distance, but be careful nonetheless." Helga nodded, following the older woman's directions. In room 4, she found 5 other women already established, their few belongings arranged neatly on simple cots. The room smelled of dampness and fear. "I'm Helga Müller," she introduced herself quietly. "Ingrid Weber," replied a blonde woman about Helga's age, telephone operator, Hamburg district. "Eva Krause," said another. "Radio Corps, Hanover." The others introduced themselves in turn. Margaret Bauer, Lotte Hoffmann and Frieda Neumann, all women who had served the war effort in administrative capacities, now prisoners in their own homeland. "How long have you been here?" Helga asked, settling onto the empty cot. 2 weeks, Ingrid replied. "They tell us nothing about what will happen to us. The food is better than what we've had for months, I'll say that much." "And the guards?" Helga couldn't help asking, her voice barely above a whisper. The women exchanged glances. "They don't bother us," Margaret said carefully, "but we stay together, always in groups." That night, as Helga tried to sleep on the unfamiliar cot, she heard sounds drifting across the compound, music unlike anything she'd heard before. Curious, despite her exhaustion, she moved to the window. "What is that?" she asked Ingrid, who had also been drawn to the sound. "They play sometimes after their duty shifts," Ingrid explained. "The Negro soldiers, they have instruments." Helga listened more carefully. A trumpet carried a melody that seemed to soar and dive, accompanied by what might have been a guitar and something percussive. The rhythm was complex, nothing like the martial music or Wagnerian opera that had been approved listening in the Reich. "It's jazz," whispered Eva, joining them at the window. "Forbidden music." "You recognize it?" Helga asked, surprised. Eva nodded slightly. "My father had records before, American jazz. He played them secretly, very quietly. He said it was the sound of freedom." "Freedom," Helga repeated, the word strange in her mouth. She had been raised to believe that it was Germany that fought for freedom, freedom from the corruption of foreign influences, from the racial pollution that threatened the folk. Yet here was music that seemed to express something wild and unrestrained, created by men she had been taught were barely human. The following morning, the routine of captivity began in earnest. The women were assigned duties, cleaning the compound, laundering clothes, preparing food under supervision. The American guards maintained a professional distance, but Helga noticed that the black soldiers interacted differently than she had expected. There was no menace in their demeanor, no predatory behavior. They were disciplined, efficient, and surprisingly courteous, given the circumstances. At noon mess, Helga found herself in line behind Frau Schmidt, who was engaged in careful negotiation with Staff Sergeant William Davis, a bespectacled black soldier who oversaw the food supplies. "Frau Fischer is ill," Schmidt was explaining. "She needs more substantial nourishment than soup." Sergeant Davis considered this. "I'll see what the medic says. If he confirms, I can authorize an egg and some canned milk." Schmidt nodded stiffly, clearly uncomfortable with the interaction, but determined to advocate for her fellow prisoner. Later that afternoon, as Helga helped with laundry duty, she observed Technical Sergeant Washington walking the perimeter of the compound. He moved with confidence, occasionally exchanging words with other soldiers. Nothing in his bearing resembled the crouching, animalistic posture depicted in propaganda illustrations. "He fought at the Siegfried Line," Eva commented quietly, noticing Helga's gaze. "I overheard the guards talking. His unit breached the defenses that were supposed to be impenetrable." "How do you understand them?" Helga asked. "I studied English in school," Eva replied, "before everything changed. My father was a professor before he was, removed from his position." Helga wanted to ask more, but the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Captain Foster, accompanied by Major Thomas Reynolds from Divisional Headquarters. "We're receiving transfer orders," Captain Foster informed Sergeant Washington. "Half the prisoners will be relocated to a permanent facility near Frankfurt next week." "Any word on how they'll be selected, sir?" Washington asked. "Administrative staff first," Major Reynolds replied. "We need to process them and clear this facility for military personnel. The war's not over yet, even if these ladies' part in it is." That evening, the mysterious music began again, earlier than the previous night. This time Helga's curiosity overcame her apprehension. While other prisoners remained indoors, she ventured to a corner of the exercise yard that offered a view of the American soldiers' quarters, a safe distance away, but close enough to observe. What she saw challenged everything she had been taught. 5 black soldiers had gathered behind their barracks. Technical Sergeant Washington stood with a trumpet, while Private Johnson sat with a guitar. Sergeant Jackson tapped on an overturned metal bucket with brushes, creating complex rhythms. 2 others, whom Helga didn't recognize, played a harmonica and what appeared to be a homemade string bass fashioned from a wooden crate and a single thick wire. The music they created was sophisticated, with each player taking turns improvising, while the others maintained the foundation. Washington's trumpet soared with a mournful, yearning quality that seemed to express both sorrow and hope simultaneously. The melody was St. James Infirmary, a traditional blues number that had become a jazz standard, though Helga couldn't have known this. So engrossed was she in the performance that Helga didn't notice Captain Foster approaching until he spoke. "Enjoying the concert, Fräulein?" Helga startled, immediately fearful. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to—" "No harm in listening," Foster said, his tone neutral. "Those boys can play, can't they? Back home, most of them couldn't perform in the same venues as white musicians. Here, at least, they've got an appreciative audience." Helga didn't understand all his words, but his meaning seemed clear enough. "They play very well," she ventured cautiously. Foster studied her for a moment. "You know, they're fighting this war for the same reasons as everyone else, to end tyranny, to go home to their families. Only difference is when they go home, they'll still be fighting for their basic rights." Before Helga could respond, Frau Schmidt appeared, visibly agitated. "Müller, you should not be out here alone," she hissed, then addressed Captain Foster. "My apologies, Captain. She is new and does not know the protocols." "No protocols being broken," Foster replied evenly. "But it's getting dark. Best everyone return to quarters." As Schmidt hurried Helga away, she whispered urgently, "You must be more careful. The Americans may seem civilized, but appearances can be deceiving." "They were just playing music," Helga protested quietly. "Music," Schmidt scoffed. "Primitive noise. Remember who you are, Müller. Remember what you've been taught." But that was precisely the problem. What Helga had been taught no longer aligned with what she was experiencing. The dissonance was becoming impossible to ignore. The following day brought steady rain, confining most prisoners to the barracks. Helga found herself increasingly drawn to Eva Kraus, whose quiet defiance of Nazi orthodoxy intrigued her. "Your father was a professor?" Helga asked, as they sat mending clothes. "What did he teach?" Eva glanced around before answering. "Literature, American and English primarily. He specialized in Hemingway, Faulkner, Steinbeck, all forbidden, of course. He was removed in '36. "And then?" Eva's hands stilled. "Then nothing. He disappeared. My mother and I received a letter saying he had been sent to a labor camp for re-education." No further communication. Helga absorbed this in silence. Such stories were not unfamiliar, but they had always been presented as necessary sacrifices for the greater good of the Reich. Now, with the Reich crumbling around them, those sacrifices seemed increasingly senseless. "I'm sorry," Helga offered inadequately. Eva shrugged slightly. "And your family?" "Dead. Hamburg 43, the firebombing." Further conversation was interrupted by commotion at the entrance to the compound. A new group of prisoners was arriving, not women this time, but men in Wehrmacht uniforms, some wounded. "Male prisoners," Ingrid observed from the window. "They must be running out of dedicated facilities." Captain Foster appeared, conferring urgently with Sergeants Washington and Jackson. The female prisoners were quickly ushered back to their barracks, while a separate area of the compound was hastily prepared for the male arrivals. Hours later, the women were permitted to return to their normal routines, though with stricter boundaries established between the male and female sections of the camp. Rumors spread quickly. "Officers," Margaret reported. "Wehrmacht officers from the Eastern Front. They say the Russians are less than 50 kilometers from Berlin." "The war is truly ending then," Frieda said softly. "Ending in defeat," Schmidt corrected sharply. "But the Führer will never surrender. There are new weapons being prepared, miracle weapons that will turn the tide." Few seemed convinced by this rhetoric, which had been repeated with diminishing credibility for months. That night, no music came from the American quarters. Instead, raised voices could be heard from the male prisoners section, followed by the sound of military police being summoned. The atmosphere in the women's barracks was tense, anticipatory. "What's happening?" Helga asked as Ingrid returned from a cautious reconnaissance to the bathroom, which offered a view of the men's area. "The new prisoners," Ingrid whispered. "They're objecting to being guarded by Negro soldiers. One of them, an officer, tried to insist on speaking only to white American officers. Called the Black Guard. Terrible names." Helga frowned. "And the Americans?" "The black sergeant, the musician, Washington. He just stood there, calm as anything, didn't react at all. Then the white captain came and told the German officer that he could either follow the rules or be placed in solitary confinement in the cellar. The confrontation apparently resolved, an uneasy quiet settled over the compound. But the mood had changed, as if an unspoken tension had been brought to the surface. The next morning, Helga was assigned to kitchen duty alongside Eva and two other women. As they peeled potatoes for the day's meals, supervised by Private Johnson, Helga noticed a small wooden object on the table near where he sat. "What is that?" she asked, speaking directly to Johnson for the first time. Johnson looked up, seemingly surprised by the question. "This? It's a chess piece, a knight. I'm carving a set." He held up the intricately detailed horse's head. "Passes the time when we're not on duty or playing music." "You made this?" Helga asked, examining the craftsmanship with genuine admiration. "It's very good." Johnson seemed momentarily uncomfortable with the praise. "My grandfather taught me. He was a furniture maker in Philadelphia. Said I had his hands." He flexed his fingers, strong yet precise. "Not much call for cabinet makers in the army, though." "Your grandfather? He was a craftsman? A master?" Helga asked, struggling to reconcile this history with what she'd been taught about black Americans' capabilities. "Yes, ma'am," Johnson replied. "One of the best. Trained in the old ways. Taught me everything I know." He hesitated, then added, "Chess is a universal language, isn't it? Played the same in America, Germany, Russia." Helga nodded, returning to her potato peeling, her mind racing. Like music, chess transcended the barriers between them, barriers she was beginning to recognize as artificial constructs. Later that day, as Helga helped distribute lunch rations, she overheard a conversation between two of the newly arrived Wehrmacht officers speaking in low tones. "Disgraceful, being guarded by Untermenschen," one muttered. "The Americans parade them around like equals." "It's psychological warfare," the other replied, "designed to humiliate us. But our time will come again. The Reich may be in retreat, but the ideology survives." Helga found herself unexpectedly angered by their words, though she couldn't have explained why. Just weeks earlier, she might have agreed with their assessment. Now, it rang hollow. The confrontation between the German officers and the American guards continued to simmer. That afternoon, as Helga and several other women worked at cleaning the administrative building, They witnessed an encounter that would prove pivotal. Major Kurt Brenner, the senior Wehrmacht officer among the new prisoners, approached the processing desk, where Sergeant Washington was reviewing documentation. "I wish to file a formal complaint," Brenner announced loudly in accented English. "The housing conditions for officers are inadequate, and the food rations insufficient." Washington looked up calmly. "Complaint forms are available, sir. All prisoners receive the same rations as specified by Geneva Convention protocols." "And who would process such a complaint?" Brenner asked derisively. "You?" "The complaint would be forwarded to headquarters," Washington replied evenly. "May I remind the Major that antagonizing camp personnel is not in the best interest of any prisoner." Brenner's face flushed with anger. "I do not recognize your authority, Sergeant. In a proper military, you would not even be permitted to wear that uniform." A tense silence fell over the room. The German women froze in their cleaning duties, watching the confrontation unfold. Helga noticed that Washington's hands remained relaxed, even as the insult landed. "Fortunately, Major," Washington replied with quiet dignity, "we are not in your idea of a proper military. We're in the United States Army, which, despite its many flaws, has managed to defeat the Wehrmacht on the battlefield. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have duties to attend to." As Washington turned away, Brenner lunged forward suddenly, his face contorted with rage. But before he could reach the sergeant, 2 military police officers stepped in, restraining the German officer. "That will be enough, Major," Captain Foster said, entering the room. "Sergeant Washington, you're dismissed. Take your scheduled break." As Washington left the building, Helga caught his eye briefly. What she saw there wasn't anger or resentment, but a profound weariness that suggested this confrontation was nothing new to him. That evening the music returned, more subdued than before. The melody was slower, more melancholy, yet still possessing that quality of resilience Helga had noticed before. Despite Frau Schmidt's disapproving glances, she moved to the window to listen. "It sounds sad tonight," she commented to Eva, who had joined her. "Not just sad," Eva replied thoughtfully. "There's something else there too, a kind of dignity maybe, a refusal to be broken." "How do you know so much about this music?" Helga asked. "I told you, my father. He said jazz was born from suffering, created by people who had every reason to despair, but chose to create beauty instead. That's why the Nazis banned it, not because it was degenerate, but because it represented a spirit they couldn't crush." Helga considered this as she listened to Washington's trumpet, weaving a complex emotional narrative through the evening air. How much else had she been wrong about? The following day, tensions continued to rise between the male prisoners and their guards. Major Brenner had been placed in solitary confinement after his outburst, but his influence remained among the other officers, who maintained a hostile stance toward the black American soldiers. Helga was surprised to find herself increasingly angered by this behavior. The cognitive dissonance was becoming unbearable, the evidence of her own experience directly contradicting years of indoctrination. The black soldiers, she observed, were disciplined, professional, and in many ways more humane than some of the Wehrmacht officers she had encountered during her service. At midday, she was assigned to help serve the meal in the women's mess hall. As she ladled soup into bowls, she found herself standing beside Sergeant Washington, who was supervising the distribution. "Your music," she said suddenly, surprising herself. "What is it called? What you were playing last night?" Washington looked at her with mild surprise. Round Midnight and Thelonious Monk wrote it, jazz musician from New York. "It was beautiful," Helga said simply. Washington studied her for a moment. "Thank you. Strange to be playing it here in Germany. Before the war, German jazz was some of the best in Europe. Did you know that? Berlin had clubs that could rival Harlem's." Helga shook her head. "They told us it was primitive music." Washington's laugh held no bitterness, only irony. "They told us a lot of things, didn't they? Both sides." He moved away to check on the bread distribution, leaving Helga to ponder his words. That evening, an unexpected announcement disrupted the camp's routine. Captain Foster addressed the assembled prisoners in the yard. "Due to operational necessities, the transfer schedule has been accelerated," he informed them. "Beginning tomorrow, prisoners will be relocated to permanent processing facilities. Women's auxiliary personnel first, followed by male prisoners. Prepare your belongings and be ready for transport at 800 hours. The news sent ripples of anxiety through the compound. Permanent facilities meant longer-term confinement, possibly in locations further from Germany, and separation from whatever fragile community had formed in the temporary camp. As the prisoners dispersed to prepare, Helga found herself approaching Captain Foster. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "may I ask where we are being sent?" Foster consulted his clipboard. Frankfurt Processing Center initially, then likely France for most of the women. The men will be sent to England or possibly America, depending on their rank and involvement. "And who will? Who will be guarding us there?" Foster regarded her curiously. "Regular army personnel. Why do you ask?" Helga hesitated, unsure herself of her motivation. "No reason, sir, thank you." Later in the barracks, the women packed their meager possessions in subdued silence. The reality of defeat and occupation was sinking in more deeply with each passing day. "I heard they're sending us to work camps in France," Frida said fearfully. "Retribution for what German forces did there." "Nonsense," Schmidt declared. "The Americans follow protocols. We will be processed and eventually released when proper order is restored to Germany." "What proper order?" Eva asked quietly. "The Reich is finished. We must face that reality." Schmidt fixed her with a cold stare. "Defeatist talk. Even now, true Germans must maintain faith." Helga found she could no longer remain silent. "Faith in what, Frau Schmidt? In lies? In the idea that some people are less than human? I've seen nothing from the American soldiers, any of them, to suggest they are what we were told." A heavy silence fell over the room. Schmidt's expression hardened. "You are young, Müller. Easily influenced. These Negroes may play their music and seem civilized, but blood tells. This is what the Führer taught us." "And if he was wrong about that," Helga pressed, "what else might he have been wrong about?" No one had an answer for her. The question hung in the air, dangerous and transformative. That night, perhaps knowing it might be their last chance, the black soldiers gathered again to play. The music was different this time, more urgent, more vibrant, as if trying to express something vital before the opportunity was lost. Despite the cool evening air, women emerged from their barracks to listen, gathering at windows and doorways. Helga moved closer than before, standing at the edge of the yard with several other women, including Eva. Even some of the male prisoners, the non-officers, drifted toward the music, maintaining their distance but clearly drawn by the sounds. Washington's trumpet led the ensemble through a piece that seemed to build and build, each player contributing to a collective statement that transcended the sum of its parts. When they finished, there was a moment of silence, followed by something unexpected. Applause, tentative at first, then growing from the assembled prisoners. The musicians looked up in surprise. Washington nodded in acknowledgement, a small smile playing at his lips. "Play another," someone called in halting English. Washington conferred briefly with the other musicians, then counted off a new number. This time it was something lighter, more danceable. "In the Mood," the Glenn Miller hit that had been popular on both sides of the conflict before the war made such cultural exchanges impossible. As the music played, Helga felt something shifting within her, not just her perspective on the men performing, but on herself, on everything she had believed. The ideological structure that had shaped her worldview was crumbling, revealing itself to be built on falsehoods and fear. The music ended, and the impromptu audience began to disperse. As Helga turned to return to her barracks, she found herself face to face with Major Brenner, who had apparently been released from solitary confinement. "Disgraceful," he spat, glaring at her. "German women fraternizing with musicians?" Helga interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "With soldiers who treat us with more dignity than some of our own officers? Perhaps what's truly disgraceful, Major, is how easily we accepted lies about them." Brenner's face darkened with anger. "You speak like a traitor." "No," Helga replied steadily. "For the first time, I'm speaking like someone who can see clearly." She walked past him, back straight, feeling both terrified and exhilarated by her own defiance. Behind her, she heard the musicians packing up their instruments, their voices low and friendly in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow they would be separated. the prisoners to permanent camps, the soldiers likely back to the front lines or to occupation duties elsewhere. But something had changed, something fundamental. Music had created a bridge where propaganda had built walls. The notes of jazz, improvised and free, had opened a space for truth to emerge, a truth about humanity that transcended the artificial categories of race and nation that had brought the world to this moment of catastrophe. As Helga prepared for sleep on her final night in the temporary camp, she thought about the journey ahead, not just the physical relocation, but the longer, more difficult journey of reconstructing her understanding of the world. The process would be neither simple nor painless, but it had begun with the sound of a trumpet, playing forbidden music in the ruins of the Third Reich. April 23, 1945. Frankfurt Processing Center. A maze of administrative buildings and barracks, surrounded by double fences and guard towers. The convoy of trucks carrying Helga and the other women prisoners from Magdeburg had arrived after a tense two-day journey through a Germany in the final throes of collapse. Allied bombing raids had forced frequent detours, and columns of defeated Wehrmacht soldiers straggling westward clogged the roads. Throughout the journey, Helga had found herself scanning the faces of their escorts, but the 761st Tank Battalion soldiers were nowhere to be seen. The black musicians who had inadvertently challenged her worldview had been replaced by regular military police, efficient but impersonal. "All prisoners disembark and form lines of 10, barked a sergeant in German-accented English. "Keep all personal belongings with you. You will be processed according to your previous military function." Helga climbed down from the truck, legs stiff from the long journey. Eva Kraus descended behind her, with Ingrid and the others following. Frau Schmidt had been separated from them at a checkpoint the previous day, taken for specialized interrogation due to her administrative rank. "Stay close to me," Eva whispered. "Whatever happens." The Frankfurt facility was vastly different from the improvised camp at Magdeburg. Everything here was standardized, industrial in scale. Hundreds of prisoners moved through a system designed to catalog, interrogate and assign them to appropriate detention based on their roles in the Nazi machinery. Inside the main processing center, Helga found herself in a cavernous hall where rows of desks were staffed by American personnel, many of them women in WS uniforms. She was directed to Desk 37, where a bespectacled corporal examined her identification papers. "Müller, Helga, stenographer, Dresden headquarters," the corporal read. "Any party membership?" "No," Helga replied truthfully. While professional advancement had been faster for party members, her stenography skills had made her valuable enough that she had never been pressured to join. "Direct access to classified communications?" "Yes, I took dictation from Obersturmbannführer Richter." The corporal looked up sharply. "SS officer?" "Yes," Helga admitted, feeling a flush of shame that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "I was assigned to his office in 1943. The corporal made several notations. "You'll be in Category B then. Further interrogation required before processing." "What does that mean?" Helga asked, anxiety rising. "It means you wait over there until your number is called," the corporal replied, handing her a paper with B247 stamped on it. "Next." Helga moved to the designated waiting area, where dozens of other women sat on benches. Many wore the hollow-eyed look of those who had seen their certainties destroyed and now faced an unknown future. She found Eva already waiting, holding a similar paper marked B193. "What did you tell them?" Helga asked quietly. "The truth," Eva replied. "That I worked in signals intelligence, that my father was removed for anti-Nazi activities." She shrugged slightly. "They'll find out everything eventually. Better to be honest from the start." Hours passed. The processing center operated with mechanical efficiency, yet the sheer volume of prisoners meant long waits. As afternoon turned to evening, Helga watched the changing shifts of American personnel. None were familiar faces from Magdeburg. "Fräulein B193 to Interrogation Room 7, called a voice over the loudspeaker. Eva squeezed Helga's hand. "Courage," she whispered, before walking toward the indicated door. Left alone, Helga found herself thinking about Technical Sergeant Washington and his fellow musicians. The memory of their music seemed impossibly distant now, like something from another life. Had it really been only days ago? She wondered where they were, whether they were still fighting, still playing jazz in moments stolen between battles. Fräulein B247 to interrogation room 12, the loudspeaker announced, jolting her from her reverie. The interrogation room was small and sparse. A metal table, 3 chairs, a single overhead light. A female lieutenant sat beside a male captain, both in intelligence branch insignia. The captain had a thick file open before him. "Sit down, Fräulein Müller," he said in flawless German. "I am Captain Mitchell. This is Lieutenant Brooks. We have some questions about your work for Obersturmbannführer Richter." For the next 2 hours, Helga answered increasingly detailed questions about communications she had transcribed, meetings she had witnessed, decisions she had documented in her precise stenographer's notes. Much of it seemed trivial, routine administrative matters, but occasionally a question would touch on something more significant. Troop deployments, orders regarding civilian populations, discussions of resistance activities. "Did you ever transcribe communications regarding the treatment of prisoners?" Lieutenant Brooks asked, her German less polished than the captain's but still competent. "Yes," Helga replied. "Regular reports on POW labor assignments." "And did these reports include mortality rates?" Helga hesitated. "Some did, particularly from the eastern camps." "And did these reports cause you any concern?" The question hung in the air. 6 months earlier, Helga would have answered without hesitation. Of course not. The reports were just statistics, numbers on a page necessary for the war effort. But now, something had changed. The faces of Washington, Johnson, and the other black soldiers appeared in her mind. Men she had been taught to see as less than human, yet who had displayed more humanity than many of her countrymen. "Yes," she finally said, surprising herself, "but I didn't allow myself to think about it. I did my job." Captain Mitchell and Lieutenant Brooks exchanged glances. "Thank you for your honesty, Fräulein Müller," Mitchell said. "One final question. Do you still believe in the principles of National Socialism?" Helga looked down at her hands, then back up at her interrogators. "No," she said quietly. "Not anymore." After the interrogation, Helga was assigned to Barracks 14, a long wooden building housing 40 women considered low security risk Category B. To her relief, she found Eva already there, sitting on a bunk near the window. "How was your questioning?" Eva asked as Helga set down her small suitcase. "Thorough," Helga replied. "They wanted details about everything I transcribed for Richter." Eva nodded. "Same with me. Signal codes, transmission patterns." She lowered her voice. "They're building cases against the higher-ups. War crimes tribunals are being prepared." The thought sent a chill through Helga. She had been present for meetings where actions were discussed that, viewed through her evolving perspective, were clearly atrocities. Would she be called to testify? Would she be implicated herself? That night, sleep eluded her. The barracks were filled with the sounds of restless women, occasional sobs, whispered conversations, the creaking of bunk frames as occupants turned in futile attempts to find comfort. Outside, searchlights swept the compound rhythmically, their beams slicing through gaps in the window blinds. In the darkness, Helga found herself humming softly, the melody Washington had played that last night in Magdeburg. "Round Midnight," he had called it. The complex, melancholy tune had lodged in her memory, becoming a strange sort of comfort. "What's that song?" came a whisper from the next bunk. "American jazz," Helga whispered back. "I heard it in Magdeburg." "Sounds sad." "Not just sad," Helga replied, echoing Eva's words from days before. "It's about surviving, making beauty despite everything." The following morning brought a surprising announcement. The processing center had received orders to accelerate categorization and begin releasing low-risk prisoners. With Allied forces pushing into the heart of Germany from both east and west, and the imminent fall of Berlin, the military government needed to free up resources for the occupation. Women in Category B with no party affiliation and no direct involvement in military operations may be eligible for early release, announced the American lieutenant at morning roll call. Those selected will be transferred to civilian internment camps, with possible release to their home regions as areas are secured and denazified. A murmur of excitement rippled through the assembled prisoners. After months or years of war, after bombardment and invasion and captivity, the prospect of returning to something resembling normal life seemed almost unimaginable. The announcement was followed by days of heightened activity. Additional interrogators arrived, processing cases more rapidly. Helga was called for a second interview, this time focused on her family background, education, and potential for reintegration into a democratic society, a phrase that struck her as both hopeful and faintly absurd, given that she had never experienced such a society. On April 27th, lists were posted of prisoners approved for transfer to the civilian facility. Helga found her name, and Eva's, among them. The transfer was scheduled for the following morning. "I never expected this," Helga confessed as they prepared their few belongings. "I thought we would be prisoners for years." "The Americans are practical," Eva replied. "They need to establish order quickly, and they're more afraid of the Russians than they are of stenographers and telephone operators." The next day, as they waited in the yard for the transport trucks, a commotion at the main gate drew their attention. A convoy of vehicles was arriving, not the expected trucks, but jeeps and staff cars flying American flags. Officers in pressed uniforms descended, accompanied by what appeared to be civilian officials. "What's happening?" Helga asked a nearby guard. "VIP inspection," the young private replied. "Some big shots from Washington and a congressional delegation. They're touring all the major facilities." The inspection party moved through the compound efficiently, mostly bypassing the ordinary prisoners. Helga had almost lost interest when a familiar figure caught her eye, not among the VIPs but among the military escort. Technical Sergeant Marcus Washington, in a freshly pressed uniform, trumpet case in hand. Their eyes met across the yard. Washington seemed equally surprised, then offered a small nod of recognition. Helga found herself smiling involuntarily. As the inspection party moved toward the administration building, one of the officers detached and approached Washington. After a brief conversation, Washington glanced in Helga's direction again, then followed the officer toward the barracks area. "Isn't that—" Eva began. "Yes," Helga confirmed, "from Magdeburg." Later that afternoon, as the prisoners were taking their allotted exercise period, a Wasi corporal approached Helga. "Fräulein Müller, you and Fräulein Krause are requested at the recreation hall at 1900 hours. "Why?" Helga asked, confused. The corporal shrugged. "Entertainment for the visiting dignitaries. Some of the prisoners with musical background have been asked to participate. Your files indicate you both have choral experience." Helga and Eva exchanged puzzled glances. It was true that they had both sung in school choirs, information that had been included in their intake forms, but neither had performed in years. "We are required to perform?" Eva asked. "Requested," the corporal emphasized. "Not required, but I would consider it an opportunity if I were you." At the appointed hour, Helga and Eva presented themselves at the recreation hall, a converted gymnasium that served as the center's venue for official functions. About 20 other prisoners were already there, along with a dozen American personnel setting up chairs and a small stage area. "Ah, excellent," said a lieutenant with a clipboard. "You must be Müller and Krause. We're organizing a short cultural program for the congressional visitors, a demonstration of our international cooperation." Sergeant Washington suggested including some German performers alongside the American musicians. As if summoned by his name, Washington appeared from a side room, accompanied by familiar faces, Private Johnson with his guitar, Sergeant Jackson with a proper drum set this time, instead of his improvised bucket. "Ladies," Washington greeted them with a nod, "good to see you made it here safely." "You as well, Sergeant," Helga replied, acutely aware of how formal they sounded compared to their last interaction. "The sergeant tells me you appreciated their jazz performance back in Magdeburg," the lieutenant said. "We thought we'd recreate that success on a larger scale, a bit of cultural exchange to impress the politicians." "But we aren't musicians," Eva protested. "Singers," Washington corrected. "Lieutenant, these ladies were in the group that listened to us play. They have choral training. I thought they might join for a number or two." The idea was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating to Helga. To perform with American soldiers playing forbidden music would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Now it felt like a symbolic step into the new reality forming around her. "What would we sing?" she asked cautiously. Washington smiled. "Ever heard Summertime? Gershwin, simple melody, works well with jazz backing." Before Helga could respond, the doors opened, and the visiting dignitaries began to enter. Officers in full-dress uniforms, civilian officials in suits, a few women in formal attire. The lieutenant hurriedly organized the performers while the audience took their seats. The program began with introductions in English and German, emphasizing the evening's theme of cultural reconciliation. First, a classical trio of American soldiers played Mozart. Then a group of German prisoners performed a traditional folk song. The atmosphere was polite but strained, the audience attentive but reserved. When Washington and his group took the stage, a subtle shift occurred. They began with "In the Mood" Thorn, the Glenn Miller standard they had played that last night in Magdeburg. The music filled the hall with a vitality that had been lacking, causing even the most dignified officials to tap their feet surreptitiously. After 2 numbers, Washington spoke briefly to the audience. "Music has always been a bridge between peoples," he said, his formal tone belying the personal significance of his words. "During some of the darkest days of this conflict, we found that jazz could communicate across barriers of language and ideology. Tonight, we'd like to demonstrate that connection by inviting 2 German singers to join us." Helga felt her heart racing as Washington gestured for her and Eva to join them on stage. This was more than a performance, it was a public declaration of transformation. As they took their places, Washington counted off softly, and the band began the gentle introduction to Summertime. Helga had never heard the song before, but Washington had spent an hour teaching them the melody and simple harmonies. As she began to sing, her initial nervousness gave way to the familiar feeling of being carried by music. Eva's voice blended with hers, creating harmonies that complemented Washington's subtle trumpet accompaniment. The song ended to enthusiastic applause. One of the civilian officials leaned toward a military officer, saying something that made him nod approvingly. As they left the stage, Helga felt a strange sense of accomplishment, not for the performance itself, but for the journey it represented. After the program concluded, the dignitaries mingled briefly with the performers before departing for their next engagement. A gray-haired civilian in an expensive suit approached Washington, shaking his hand vigorously. "Remarkable demonstration, Sergeant," he said. "Exactly the sort of thing we need to show back home. Music as diplomacy, very good optics." Washington nodded politely. "Thank you, sir. The credit goes to these ladies as well." He gestured toward Helga and Eva. "They've shown remarkable adaptability." The official barely glanced at them before moving on, his interest in the optics apparently satisfied. As the Americans began to pack up their instruments, Helga found a moment to speak privately with Washington. "Are you stationed here now?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just passing through with the congressional tour. We're heading to Berlin next and what's left of it. The 761st is part of the occupation force now that the fighting's mostly done." "And the music?" Washington smiled. "That continues. Always. We've been playing for troops, for civilians, for whoever needs to hear something besides artillery and grief." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad to see you're being processed for civilian status. You'll be heading home soon." The question gave Helga pause. "Home? I'm not sure what that means anymore. Hamburg was destroyed. My family is gone." Washington nodded in understanding. "Many of us will be returning to places that don't feel like home either. Different reasons, but similar outcome." "Will things be better for you when you return to America?" Helga asked, the question more direct than she would have dared weeks ago. Washington considered this. "Better than before the war. In some ways, we've proven ourselves on the battlefield, shown what we can do when given the chance. But the same old systems are still in place." He shrugged. "But change is coming, slow but sure. This war shook everything up. Nothing can go back to exactly how it was, for any of us." Before they could continue, the lieutenant called for the performers to assemble for departure. Washington extended his hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in Nazi Germany. A black man offering to shake hands with a German woman as an equal. "Good luck, Fräulein Müller," he said formally. "Perhaps someday we'll hear jazz in Berlin again, And you'll be in the audience. Helga took his hand. I hope so, Sergeant Washington, and thank you, for the music, and for... She struggled to articulate what she meant. For helping me see differently. The next morning, Helga and Eva, along with 30 other women categorized as low risk, were transported to a civilian internment facility near Wiesbaden. The change was immediate and dramatic. No armed guards, more freedom of movement, civilian administrators instead of military personnel, and a focus on re-education rather than interrogation. Over the following weeks, they attended mandatory lectures on democracy, viewed films documenting Nazi atrocities that many had refused to believe existed, and began the process of psychological demilitarization. The experience was painful but necessary, like lancing a wound to allow healing to begin. By June, with Germany's unconditional surrender now a matter of record and the process of rebuilding beginning across the shattered country, the first releases were announced. Helga and Eva, having consistently demonstrated what the Americans called democratic potential, were among those approved to return to civilian life under the supervision of local military government officers. The day before their release, they sat together in the facility's garden, contemplating the uncertain future. "What will you do?" Helga asked. Eva smiled slightly. "I've been offered a position as a translator with the American administration in Frankfurt. My English is useful to them now." She hesitated. "And you?" "I don't know," Helga admitted. "Return to stenography, I suppose. It's the only skill I have." "You could do something different," Eva suggested. "The universities will reopen eventually. You could study." "Study what?" "Whatever you want. Music, perhaps." Helga laughed softly. "Because I sang one Gershwin song?" "Because music changed you," Eva replied seriously. "It might do the same for others." The idea took root in Helga's mind, not as a specific plan, but as a possibility. In a world being reformed from the rubble of war, perhaps there was space for new paths, new identities. The following morning, with release papers in hand and a small stipend for immediate expenses, Helga and Eva stood at the gate of the internment facility, facing a Germany they barely recognized, physically destroyed, but ideologically unshackled, occupied but slowly regaining autonomy. "Stay in touch," Eva said, embracing her friend, "whatever happens." "I will," Helga promised. "We're witnesses now, to both the worst and the possibility of better." They parted ways, Eva to her new position with the occupation authorities, Helga to a temporary housing center in Frankfurt, where she would begin rebuilding her life from nothing. In the months and years that followed, Germany's path to recovery would be neither straight nor easy. Denazification would prove complicated and inconsistent, with many former officials slipping back into positions of influence. The division of Germany into occupation zones would harden into the Cold War split between East and West. Jazz would flourish in the American-controlled sectors, but remain suspect in the Soviet zone. For Helga, the journey would be equally complex. Using her clerical skills, she would eventually secure a position with the new West German Broadcasting Service. When Armed Forces Radio began broadcasting jazz programs across occupied Germany, she would become an avid listener, gradually building knowledge of the music that had first opened her eyes to a different reality. By 1948, she would be helping to organize jazz concerts in Frankfurt, bringing together American musicians stationed in Germany with emerging German jazz artists. The music that had been labeled degenerate by the Nazi regime would become a symbol of the new democratic West Germany, modern, connected to the world, embracing artistic freedom. On a warm evening in July 1952, Helga stood at the back of a packed club in Frankfurt, watching a mixed group of American and German musicians perform. The visiting American combo included a trumpet player from New Orleans, not Marcus Washington, who had returned to America years earlier, but someone who had played with him, who recognized Helga's name when she introduced herself after the show. "Marcus, sure, I know him," the musician confirmed. "He's teaching music now, in Louisiana. Still plays too, weekend gigs, recording sessions when he can get them. Man's a genius with that horn." "Please tell him, if you speak to him," Helga said, that the German woman from the Magdeburg camp says thank you. He'll remember. Tell him his music traveled farther than he knows. Later that night, walking home through a Frankfurt rebuilt from the rubble of war, Helga reflected on the distance she had traveled, not just physically but morally and intellectually. The journey had begun with music, with the sound of a trumpet playing forbidden melodies that cut through years of indoctrination. She thought about the thousands of other Germans who had experienced similar transformations through direct contact with those they had been taught to fear or despise. The occupation, for all its hardships, had forced a confrontation with reality that no amount of propaganda could withstand. And while many clung to old prejudices, many others had found their way to new understanding. In her small apartment, Helga removed a cherished possession from its shelf, a record of Round Midnight, the Thelonious Monk composition that Technical Sergeant Washington had played that pivotal evening in Magdeburg. She placed it carefully on her phonograph, adjusting the volume to a quiet level appropriate for the late hour. As the familiar melody filled the room, she closed her eyes, remembering the faces of Washington and his fellow musicians, men who had shown more humanity in defeat than many of her countrymen had in victory. Their music had been an act of resistance against dehumanization, a declaration that artistry and dignity could survive even the worst that war could inflict. The war had ended 7 years ago, but its lessons continued to unfold. Germany was rebuilding not just its cities, but its soul, a process that would take generations. Music, jazz in particular, had become part of that reconstruction, a reminder that human creativity transcends the artificial boundaries of race and nation that had fueled the catastrophe of war. For Helga personally, the journey from fear to understanding had been both painful and liberating. The collapse of one worldview had made space for another, more humane perspective to take root. It wasn't a perfect transformation. Doubts and old habits of thought sometimes resurfaced, but the direction was clear and irreversible. As the record played its final notes, Helga thought about all the parallel journeys taking place across Germany and beyond, millions of individual reckonings, with complicity, with deception, with the possibility of redemption. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but at least it was no longer built on lies. In the new Germany slowly emerging from the ashes of the Third Reich, jazz had found its place, no longer forbidden, no longer feared, but embraced as part of a cultural renewal. And in that small but significant transformation, Helga saw hope for all the larger changes still to come. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.